Welcome, everybody who has come to our webinar today. We'll get started in just a minute. I'm Reverend Ron Stief. I'm the Executive Director of National Religious Campaign Against Torture. And every year for Human Rights Day, it's one of those bittersweet days because we're all doing amazing work on human rights and we're having victories, but there always seems like there's more to do. I'm hoping that we can get some inspiration from the speakers today, from the staff of NRCAT and all the work that we're being engaged in around the country and that we're doing to support the work that you're doing. Um, I'll go ahead and launch us by saying something that some of you may know who've been with us for a while. 2026 is NRCAT's 20th anniversary year. So I thought in order to introduce the webinar, I want to take us back over how did we get here in this human rights that NRCAT is currently engaged in and has been engaged in these past 20 years. And really, how does that history define our work to defend human rights today? Because it really does. NRCAT was founded not long after the faith community began to respond to the images of the torture in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. They were publicly released in 2004. The photos really showed people some horrifying examples of torture and abuse of detainees that were being held by the U.S. overseas in the war against terror, the post 9/11 environment. Um, there was one iconic photo that, if any of you remember one photo, you'll remember it was of a detainee that was standing on top of a cardboard box, had a hood over his head. Electrical wires were extended from his outreached hands. Uh, it went viral, and back before things really do go viral like they do now on social media. And it really became a rallying cry for U.S. groups to work to end the torture that the United States was engaged in the post 9/11 environment. So it was really the relentless organizing of NRCAT, the faith community, the human rights community, advocates, who continued to expose the use of torture that we then found out was happening at CIA black site prisons in other countries, at Guantanamo prison, which NRCAT has been campaigning to close Guantanamo for the entire time of its existence, in prisons globally. This was under the G.W. Bush administration. And we had a major victory in 2015, midway through the Obama administration. The Senate Intelligence Committee released a report that we had advocated for years. Somebody needs to report on what was happening with this torture so that we can make sure it doesn't happen again. And the executive summary of the Senate Intelligence Committee report was released on the torture, the post 9/11 torture. It was placed as an amendment, the McCain-Feinstein Amendment, into the National Defense Authorization Act that passed that year. And it included banning CIA from ever again using torture of detainees during interrogations, which essentially limited interrogation techniques to those that were already being practiced by the military side of our national security work in the Army Field Manual. Now, also in 2015, as this was happening, NRCAT also was working on the torture of solitary confinement in our own backyards here in the U.S. And in 2015, some of us will remember President Obama gave a speech at the NAACP conference, and he publicly questioned the torture and abuse of solitary confinement in the U.S. And he said, do we really think it makes sense to lock so many people alone in tiny cells for 23 hours a day, sometimes for even months or year at a time, he said. Well, right after that, he became the first U.S. president to visit a federal prison. In fact, I remember us campaigning to try to get him to go inside a solitary confinement cell. He didn't do that, but he was in the prison. He had the conversation with the folks that were in the prison, and he came out and ordered the Department of Justice to conduct a comprehensive review of the use of solitary confinement in prisons and jails across the country. Really, the first time that a U.S. president had so clearly recognized the damage that solitary confinement was doing to people that are in the prisons and jails and detention in this country. So this 2016 executive action that resulted from that visit and from our advocacy, looking at federal detention, because that's the one thing that the president can do an executive action around. It banned youth solitary. It prohibited solitary for people committing low-level infractions and set a maximum time of 60 days for anyone in solitary because of a minor offense. We know now, those of you who follow what NRCAT is working on, that we have UN standards that limit it to 15 days, and NRCAT is actually working to limit it to almost no days of extreme isolation and substitute with programming. But at that time, that was an important start in 2016. Um, Though President Obama did not have jurisdiction over the state systems and local systems, he called on the nation to follow his lead in calling for an end to what he was calling this affront to our common humanity. A couple more things I want to say about kind of where we have gone then since that period in 2016. NRCAT was talking with the ACLU prison program at the time about founding a campaign to work on solitary at ending solitary at the state and local level. That's where 90% of the people in solitary are being held. And I'm proud to say that that campaign, called the Unlock the Box campaign, has now grown to provide financial and training support for 23 state anti-solitary campaigns around the country. And they've resulted in amazing moments of awareness in state legislatures about this important issue in their communities, and has really led to some victories in some states, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Nevada, uh, really giving us a sense that a state can take action to try to ban solitary. And then, of course, it's all about the implementation. We'll hear about some of that when Johnny speaks later. But these are the pillars I wanted folks to understand for Human Rights Day over the last 20 years. And our 300 plus institutional faith members have been with us all the way. During Torture Awareness Month in 2008, we had 330 houses of worship across the USA putting up banners saying torture is always wrong and it's a moral issue. That was important to say at that moment in the war against terror. The faith community worked in the first Trump administration. I remember getting a hold of an order of women religious in Iowa who delivered a petition NRCAT organized. We called on Mike Pompeo, who Trump wanted to be the director of CIA, to state in his confirmation hearing that he would actually follow the law that we passed that said the CIA would not engage in torture. We carried that petition into Pompeo's Senate confirmation. It also came in, I think, about a year later with the confirmation of Gina Haspel to that position when Pompeo was moved to a different position. So now we're faced with another challenging Trump administration. My read is that I think this administration learned some things the first time around about how to violate people's human rights and get away with it, unfortunately. It gives us a much larger task, especially now that House and Senate Republicans are largely standing behind him, although we see cracks in that as well. The Supreme Court is standing behind much of this. Again, we hope that our voice is giving them the courage to stand up for human rights when really they aren't being asked to by their own president. Um, so why don't we turn to TC Morrow, who's NRCAT's Director of Finance and Operations. And I want us to hear how we can find success for our human rights advocacy under the Trump administration. I think there's a convergence in our call for banning torture in the U.S. national security policy, the current focus of ICE detaining immigrants, and more are being sent to solitary. Some are being sent to third countries with a record of torture. And there are reports of mass torture of people that we are offshoring in the media, and the public is becoming more and more aware of that. That really ties into the work that we've done historically on national security policy, including this January 11th, we're going to be again calling for the closure of Guantanamo prison, which hasn't been closed yet. So, TC, I'd like to see if you could speak to us for a minute. What are the leverage points that NRCAT can be using in this moment to shift policy or to shift that important narrative that shapes public opinion.
Thanks, Ron, and thanks for the overview of NRCAT in in our collective work in these last 20 years. I'll mention a few areas, including third country deportations, the CCOT prison in El Salvador, and post 9/11 detainees at Guantanamo, along with the Trump administration's desire to be able to house 30,000 immigrants at Guantanamo. But before I unpack those more, first I'll share a few words of reflection on this Human Rights Day and what keeps me going in this work. Yesterday, I saw some pictures taken during the drafting process of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the drafting committee, and on seeing her picture, my mind went to a trip that I took this past summer that included a stop in Seneca Falls, New York. It was in 1848 that the first major women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls. And a century later, an American woman happened to be who was chairing an international effort to draw up an international bill of human rights. And thankful for Eleanor Roosevelt's leadership and others in what ended up on December the 10th, 1948, the UN General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In a moment in US history where my own rights and the rights of many I care about have been especially under attack, I've found it incredibly important to remember my ancestors, both ancestors in the faith and ancestors who have fought for their own rights and the rights of their fellow human beings. Esther, Moses, and Isaiah from the New Testament in my own tradition, Paul and Silas, the Ethiopian eunuch, and Mary Magdalene. Others, including Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Gandhi, Bayard Rustin, and Eleanor Roosevelt, just to name a few. I've sought to draw strength from others standing up for human rights, from those in local communities across the country who are getting their cell phones out and documenting arrests by ICE, to pro bono lawyers, to human rights defenders who are documenting abuse at great personal risk. And of course, drawing strength from survivors themselves who have shouldered the weight of detention and still turn towards life time and again. Their courage reminds me that the long arc of human rights work is carried by ordinary people making moral choices every day. And faith communities have always been part of that arc, insisting that dignity is not optional. So let me lift up a few places where that insistence matters now, and then Johnny will be sharing more directly about our anti-solitary confinement work. First, on third country deportations. While it had happened occasionally under previous administrations, the Trump administration has greatly increased the use of third country removals. In other words, sending immigrants to countries that were not where the immigrant lived prior to coming to the US or where they have citizenship. There's the real possibility of continued detention or torture or abuse when individuals are sent to third countries. And then also the possibility that they'll be sent back to their country of origin, where they also potentially face the same torture, abuse, or continued detention. Over this past summer, Senator Tim Kaine introduced 6 resolutions in the US Senate seeking information on the human rights practices of 6 countries to which the US has reportedly deported immigrants who have no ties to those countries. And a similar resolution regarding El Salvador failed earlier this year. Given a process under Section 502BC of the Foreign Assistance Act, the senator can force debate and a vote on the resolutions. While the resolutions are unlikely to pass, they do give an opportunity to raise concerns on the Senate floor about sending immigrants to places where they may be tortured or where they may be returned to their home countries and tortured. The resolutions have not yet come up on the Senate floor. We actually thought they might come up after the August recess, but we know that the Congress has been doing both a lot and nothing in the last few months. And so these resolutions are still uh, yet to come up. And so we encourage you to contact your senators to ask them to support the resolutions. And we've got an action alert that you can use or your organizations can send out to others as well. And Nicole will drop that link in the chat to you to that action alert. On Guantanamo, which NRCAT has, from its very beginning, been calling for the closure of Guantanamo, there are still 15 men in detention at Guantanamo out of the 779 in total who were detained after 9/11 at Guantanamo. And those 15 men includes 3 men who are cleared for transfer and an additional 3 men who have never been charged with a crime and are being held in indefinite detention. There had been efforts a few years ago for plea deals in the 9/11 cases, but unfortunately, those plea deals are off the table, and the cases are still in pretrial hearings, and a trial is nowhere near. Hearings are actually scheduled for next week. We'll see whether they indeed happen, but it has been a very long process, and our partners at the family member organization, September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, have been major supporters of the plea deals, and NRCAT and others have supported them as well as an opportunity for closure, and that the men in agreeing to the plea deals would be sharing details from the attacks in order for there to be some justice in that front. But unfortunately, those are off the table. Some of the things that we can continue to do are indeed if if it were ever appropriate in the future, politically for the plea deals to go forward, certainly to support those. And certainly right now, even though there's not an office in the State Department working on it, for us to push the administration to transfer the 3 men who are cleared for transfer. Their lawyers continue to work on that. Ron mentioned that the anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo is coming up, and if anybody would like a closed Guantanamo banner to hang outside your house of worship or to use individual, please just let me know. I'll also go ahead and mention an effort by some of our partner organizations that have formed the Guantanamo Survivors Fund, and it's helping men formerly held at Guantanamo and their families with assistance on housing and healthcare and transportation. And in the first 2 years, that fund has raised more than $100,000 and gave 40 men and their families small grants, and they continue to raise funds for that. And you can learn more at gsfund.org. That's the Guantanamo Survivors Fund. Migrants have, as we know, migrants have been taken from the US to Guantanamo and then either sent on to other countries, or some have actually been returned to the US. And the numbers have been nowhere near the 30,000 number that the administration said it was going to prepare for. And reports are that there have been about 700 so far this year. Lawsuits have been filed to end sending immigrants from the US to Guantanamo. And you probably saw in the news that last week, a federal judge concluded that federal law does not authorize the administration to hold migrants at overseas military institutions. So we urge you to continue to call for an end to sending immigrants to Guantanamo or to any overseas military bases, in addition to the opposition of expanded immigration detention in our own communities. And I know that so many of you are doing so much. My great thanks to many people of faith who are joining in opposing the too often deplorable conditions of ICE detention across our country, which has unfortunately included reports of solitary confinement being used to coerce people into self-deporting. I'll switch to speaking a little bit about the atrocious act of sending uh, people to the maximum security prison, the CCOT in El Salvador. In the spring, the Trump administration invoked the Alien Enemies Act and sent about 200 men to the CCOT. And in July, a prisoner swap then uh, sent 252 of the men to Venezuela. Reports on torture and abuse at the CCOT abound. And in November, Human Rights Watch released a report, quote, "You have arrived in hell," end quote, torture and other abuses against Venezuelans in El Salvador's mega prison. And thanks, Nicole, for dropping the link to that. I encourage you to read and share that report. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and the local church I'm connected to is part of an interfaith network of faith communities united in collective action to support immigrant justice and dignity. Now, I don't always get to go to vigils or events with both the local church and my NRCAT hat on, but since April, I've joined faith leaders and other advocates from across the greater Washington, D.C. area for press conferences outside the federal courthouse in Greenbelt. I see a name or two of folks that have joined us today that have also joined in those. Thank you. And that I've also sat in on several of the hearings, and these are about the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia challenging first his being sent to the CCOT in El Salvador, and then ongoing challenges of his detention and regarding where he might be sent next. And I'll just say that I was in the courtroom, I think, on 3 different days, and it was just unbelievable. The lack of information and transparency being provided, not being provided by the administration, and the judge actually on what was potentially the last perhaps the last hearing, she thanked those that had been present over many hearings just to bear witness to it. And that's just one example of the ways that we as people of faith can be bearing witness and continuing to oppose sending immigrants to offshore detention sites, especially to notorious sites of torture and abuse like the CCOT. And friends, in whatever ways you're involved in advocating for human rights, know that the NRCAT staff are here with resources and certainly a listening ear as you plan for actions, public education, advocacy, legislative visits in your own communities. And you can contact Ron or Johnny or I at any point. Thanks, Ron.
Thanks, TC. That was great. And yeah, organized advocacy is making a difference. It really is. The presence that we all know we need to provide, and also the advocacy. It's part of the formula that we try to keep alive all year long on human rights. So Johnny Perez is going to next talk about NRCAT's work on the ground on human rights with solitary survivors, faith leaders, civil and human rights advocates, all working to end the torture of solitary confinement at the state and local level. As I mentioned earlier, that's where 90% of those in solitary are being held. I mentioned also earlier that NRCAT is now working across 23 state campaigns to end solitary. It's estimated that there's 122,000 people being held in U.S. solitary confinement right now, right while we're having this webinar. 122,000 people are in tiny cells the size of a parking space. And solitary survivors have always been in the lead, but increasingly in the lead through some of the work that NRCAT is doing along with faith and human rights leaders, legislative campaigns, policy campaigns. We're winning limits in some states. We're winning ends to solitary in some states. The implementation is intense. Johnny's right in the middle of it. And so, Johnny, why don't you fill us in on how NRCAT is kind of bringing this unique perspective of our coalition and voice on torture to advocacy on behalf of all the people, the families, the communities who are all being harmed in the U.S. carceral system.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ron. And this is actually a really great way to kind of end the year, especially with Human Rights Day today, and all the work that NERCA has been doing collectively over the years. And I've been proud to be in this role for almost, 8 years now. So it's been quite a ride, and hopefully we're putting ourselves out of a job. But on Human Rights Day, today is particularly, important to me, having been, a person who's also experienced solitary confinement and now supports others who've experienced the same torture. So really honored to be in this role for as long as I have been and be with an organization that really does, fight for the rights of all people, you know. So for NRCAT, I want to mention, I want to say a few things as I go into my remarks there, but just wanted to ground my remarks there is that the very particular combination of moral clarity, survivor leadership, and strategic coordination is what I value the most about, the work that we do. First, I'll start off with something, some of the remarks has already been mentioned by my colleagues TC and also Ron, that we mobilize faith leaders as moral anchors in this fight. For many communities, the moral voice of clergy carries weight that politics alone can't touch. So we educate and equip faith leaders through webinars, devotionals, film screenings, and action briefings that help them understand solitary confinement as a profound human rights violation. This particular year, our faith-based work expanded significantly from screenings of the strike throughout the country to Torture in Our Name that many of you have either seen or screened it in yourself in churches and our community spaces, opened up deep conversations about trauma, accountability, and dignity. Clergy who attended these events later showed up in legislative hearings, vigils, and even coalition meetings that joined larger movements beyond their own community, lifting up solitary confinement not just as a management tool, but as a violation of human dignity. Just wanted to kind of close the loop on that and mention that second, as Ron mentioned, we center survivor leadership not just as testimony, but as strategy. And through our National Network of Solitary Survivors and our U.S. Prisons Programs Advisory Council, which is comprised of all solitary survivors from different parts of the country, different experiences, we've created a real leadership pathway that moves beyond just storytelling, if you will. So this year, survivors shaped everything from state campaign messaging, to coalition responses to national messaging, like I mentioned. Their lived expertise directly inform how we responded to implementation crises, for example, in HALT in New York, as we understand that conditions facing people are still inside and the importance of implementing these policies that we are passing. At our advisory council meeting this year, our advisory council emphasized a lot of the work that we've been seeing on the ground in terms of the importance of upholding implementation on bills that we've passed, and identifying more solitary survivors in places where we have gaps and not enough representation, including expanding our materials to other languages to ensure that we are identifying solitary survivors from all walks of life, especially now as many people who don't necessarily speak English are under attack by this administration. They also emphasize the importance and the continued importance of healing justice. We do this work and we do it because we care. We do it because we empathize. We do it because we are just human beings. But it also takes a toll on us in doing the work in a way that also allows us to heal at the same time while not hurting ourselves in the process. And not only as a practice, but as an actual essential leadership infrastructure as we develop leaders to ensure that, we're emphasizing the principles of healing justice. That guidance now actually actively helps guide our work into 2026 and has guided it, in the past years, especially since the advisory council went live about 3 years or so ago. So I want to say that when we talk about the work being guided by people who are directly impacted, it's not just by me, people in these roles, but also even I need advice from people who also did time in solitary confinement, their family members, people in their communities, and what they're hearing to really be able to guide the work, especially since we are national organizations and we mainly work with state partners who are doing amazing work across their 23 state campaigns nationwide. Third, I want to say that we provide rapid response, more framing when crises erupt. This year alone in New York, we showed how just critical that is. When misinformation spreads or fear-driven narratives try to roll back the changes and the reforms that we've made, NRCAT has done a really good job at stepping in to stabilize the conversation with clear, principled, clear-driven messaging. During the halt, and even I guess I can even mention on this call very recently, there's a crisis in Bedford. We've mobilized really fast to align messaging across our survivors, faith leaders, and of course our people on the ground, whether it's this New York campaign for alternatives to isolated confinement, or our national partners like the Unlock the Box campaign or the federal anti-solitary task force that is working to advance the End in Solitary Confinement Act. We've also supported response letters to the governors and attorney generals in some instances, which, one particular here in New York, as I mentioned, to ensure that the narratives remain grounded in human dignity rather than in fear. Since what we're seeing a lot now in the media, and we always have, but I think there's an increase of it about the fear mongering and the otherizing of other folks and pitting people against each other. We see our role is often to lower the temperature, raise the moral floor, and bring coherence to spaces that can easily fracture under political pressure. Fourth, I'll mention that we embed healing justice into every part of our leadership work. As I mentioned before, solitary survivors are leading campaigns. They're speaking publicly. They're organizing communities, and that requires real support. And leadership for us is not necessarily to be extracted, but to be nurtured. And when you can see in the coming years exactly more of that, of us holding our leaders, nurturing our leaders for them to be able to lead and continue leading in the ways that they have been doing across the state campaigns, including our priority states. Finally, we've strengthened coalitions by connecting them with the right people in the right rooms. NRCAT sits at the intersection of with survivors, with faith leaders, with community members, and again, our national partners, Unlock the Box, the Federal Anti-Solitary Task Force, and our individuals in our state level campaigns that are all working on the ground. From LaQuasia Jones, who is our coordinator, working with our national network of solitary survivors, going out to New Orleans and working closely with the folks on the ground there, to survivors like Stephen Mangual, who did a number of screenings in Florida, to folks like Virginia and Natasha White, who, in fact, quick shout out to her. She's going to do a screening on the 13th, I believe. So you'll get more information about that. And being able to build the infrastructure to connect people with the right tools, with the right resources, and the right equipping them with the right skills to be able to lead. And you can see a continued effort to be able to do that. Our role is to align messaging, share intelligence across state campaigns. Since we're talking to everyone, part of our responsibility is to share that intelligence, but also strategy across those states and best practices, and ensure that our survivor voices and human rights framework stays centered at the work. This year, that looked like harmonizing national and state messaging during the New York halt backlash, and a number of other states supporting implementation oversight efforts, not only in Nevada and New Jersey and in New York, but also uplifting survivor leadership in states like California, where the Mandela Act was vetoed, and did a number of screenings and uplifting, survivor leadership there. Shout out to Dolores Canales, who organizes a number of folks there in California, and identifying, states where we actually have leadership gaps from our survivors, and planning to fill those gaps. In conclusion, and I know I'm talking fast here, but in conclusion, I'll say a few things. That NRCAT's power lies in combining moral clarity, survivor wisdom, and coordinated strategy to confront torture wherever it occurs. Wherever it occurs, especially in our own domestic prison system, while also not turning a blind eye to what's happening internationally and beyond our borders. Through this combination in our voice, the moral authority, the survivor leadership, the coordinated strategy, and the human rights lens that refuses to separate what happens in United States prisons from broader struggles against torture. So this is how we advocate for people, families, communities being harmed. And for me, again, it's a personal fight, having been impacted by these issues long before I was released, I guess. Thank you, Ron. Back to you all. And if there's any questions, I have not looked at the chat. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. That's really important. Um, I hope everybody got a sense. I mean, for myself at least, it's pretty rare to see an organization like NRCAT that can have such a strong federal presence on federal policy and footprint. I mean, whether it's trying to continuing to work to close Guantanamo or challenging the third country deportations, or as Johnny mentioned, the federal End Solitary Confinement Act, which we have helped push in both the Senate side and the House side, and we continue to gain sponsors for that every day. We just were part of, a couple of days ago, of being one of the organizational endorsers of the Dignity for Detained Immigrants Act, which was introduced on the Hill, I think this last week. And we have those kinds of relationships with folks that are really in positions of power, and in some cases, even folks that are directly working in corrections or directly working in the national security work, to really try to bring the moral voice to what needs to be done policy-wise in this nation to become a nation and to be the nation that can really respect human rights. And like I said, it's a real uphill battle now. But on the other hand, our voice is getting out. Our voice is not being stamped out. We're working to lay the groundwork for the future. So I wanted to close with just um, a few points about how you heard some of how you can get involved with NRCAT. Why don't we look at the first slide because I want to show you the team. You see myself. Oh, okay, where'd the team go? You see myself, TC, Johnny, Niquasia. This is the staff of NRCAT, and a lot of people wonder how can four people get so much done? It's not four people. We are, we're everywhere. We have folks in state campaigns. We have folks on the ground. We have people that have been doing some of the vigiling for 20 years. And that's where the amazing strength of our grassroots continues to lift issues that we are raising here, but in your own local context. And we're resourcing folks. We're always there. So we do have resources. We have something on the next slide. You'll see, for example, that some people have been vigiling to close Guantanamo monthly for years, every the first Wednesday of the month. It's part of how we keep that visible because otherwise it'll be forgotten. The 23rd of each month, we actually did do one of these how-to webinars with the Wisconsin faith community, who is doing vigils on the solitary confinement on the 23rd of each month to recognize that many people are in solitary for 23 hours a day. They also talked about how they do vigils to support the families when someone dies in the prison. So there's a lot of this that's happening across the country that you can participate in. We have resources, we have ways to talk to you about that. We have folks you can talk about how they're finding success with either the media or recruitment in these kind of campaigns. In fact, that's who's in the picture. I noticed now was one of the vigils in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and Wisdom. We have a whole how-to webinar just on that we'd be glad to send you if you wanted to show it to your local congregation. The next slide, we would probably get to where TC was describing the banner campaigns. Yes, people still put banners outside on their churches telling, and their synagogues and their masjids and their temples telling people, hey, this is what we stand for. You know, if you stand for this, come on in. If you don't stand for it, well, at least come have a conversation with us about why we do. Those banners are available. It was part of a major campaign that NRCAT did years ago, but we bring those to conferences of the faith community. We bring those to convenings, speaking engagements. Those banners do get around, and like TC said, if you want one for your advocacy, get a hold of, there it is, T Morrow at nearcat.org, and we'll send you one. The next slide, I believe, will show you about our merch. I was on a meeting with Johnny earlier today. He had one of these on. It looked fantastic. Two people on there got a hold of me afterwards and said, "Hey, I want to get one of those t-shirts. Where do I get it?" We have a merch store at bonfire.com. I wear mine when I wear my collar. I wear mine over my collar. It's the torture is a moral issue one there. When I go to protests in different places where we're all there, letting people know that this is a moral fight that we're in. So wear your values, and that's another way you can not so much support NRCAT. We don't. I don't think we make any money on these T-shirts. I think it's mostly just to get out there again and let people know that we are here. We have not given up on our values, that human rights is an important part of our, needs to be an important part of this country. Um, the next slide is the how to become a lifeline, how to unlock the box. We have ready-made quarterly training series programs for the faith community and faith advocates that you can show at one of your next meetings. This one's going to be 45 minutes long, so it's about ready to close. They're about that length and really important work that people are doing is kind of focused in. So how to become a lifeline is on the Pen Pal program that Solitary Watch uses that a lot of the NearCap members are involved. In fact, one of our donors, we do an end of year fundraising campaign. One of our donors sent in a donation and she said, I remember I saw the How to Become a Lifeline webinar. One of the members of our church has been a pen pal with somebody in solitary for over 10 years. So that's something that anybody can do, and it's a great thing to offer to your members of your congregations. How to Unlock the Box really digs into the 23 state campaigns and what is happening out there in the states and how you can get involved in those. So we have those resources that are available to anybody, in addition to the films that Johnny talked about. And then, of course, for those of you who are working with survivors, really encourage you to get people to join the national network, the survivors in your campaigns or in your congregation to check out the NearCat National Network of Solitary Survivors. As Johnny gave a good description of what that's doing. It's growing. I've been to some of the meetings, and it's just amazing the anchor that this is providing for survivors who are out there doing the advocacy alongside of all of us and leading the advocacy in so many places. So Johnny and Nequasia and really all of us are so much a part of helping to work with these survivors in the campaigns that they have going to try to strengthen their work and make their work more visible.
Also, I'll add in there, if folks watching this also, have ongoing work where the work, could be amplified by the voices of those who've been impacted by, solitary confinement or other carceral issues. We're constantly looking for opportunities to plug in our network members. We have 128 people across about like 28 states, which is a little bit more than we actually have state level campaigns. And of course, like Ron said, if you do have survivors in your network, or even if you know people in your community or space, please share the info with them. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And we also have the Humans Out of Solitary film series, which are 3 to 5 minute um, clips, and some of the people that you see on the screen there are actually interviewed in there, and it's important. They're interviewed about their yes, talking about their time in solitary, but also about their life after solitary, which I think is something that is not often emphasized. The you could be sitting next to somebody who's not in a solitary confinement cell anymore, not in prison anymore, but either they or a loved one has had impact from solitary confinement. So they talk a little bit about that in terms of the context of their lives. I've seen this it was used as an intro slide to a Baylor Medical School presentation. These are often used to introduce meetings, to introduce a survivor's voice into a meeting where you're talking about human rights and mass incarceration. So these are important tools that I hope you can. One of the slides made it onto John Oliver's last week tonight, which I think got several million views. Um, so you'll be in good company. Um, there's the QR code. We have our national pledge to end solitary that you can sign up for. You'll get on the NRCAT mailing list. And of course, our website, nearcat.org.